Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Isabella Salgado. I am a Senior Policy Associate at JPAL, where I support the crime, violence, and conflict sector, and I also manage our crime and violence initiative. It is our pleasure to be hosting this event today, along with our colleagues of JPAL's Governance Initiative and IPA's Peace and Recovery Program. This webinar on the role of the state in combating violence against women is the second in a series of webinars sharing emerging insights from our work to improve the evidence base on governance, crime, and conflict over the past 3 years. Our first webinar happened in November, and it discussed studies of social cohesion interventions. I can ask my colleagues, Amy and April, who will be supporting me today, to add the link of the recording on the chat in case you are interested in checking it out. Finally, our next webinar in this series will happen on April 23rd, and it will cover research around justice provision, both by the state and non-state actors. So stay tuned for that. So before we start the conversation today, I'll just do a quick intro of what is the Governance, Crime, and Conflict Initiative. So together, JPAL's Crime and Violence Initiative, JPAL's Governance Initiative, as well as IPA's Peace and Recovery Program, form the Joint Governance, Crime, and Conflict Initiative, or GCCI, which is supported by the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And we have been doing this work since 2017, and GCCI funds rigorous policy-relevant research to determine what works to improve governance and reduce crime, violence, and conflict in low and middle-income countries. We support research in a variety of topics, including the ones listed here on the screen. And this research aims to test solutions to help design better policies and programs that are trying to overcome crime, violence, conflict, corruption, and instability. We want to improve governance and also support recovery and resilience in countries that have been affected by crisis or disasters. This research we support also aims to answer fundamental questions about these topics, answers which can help us provide generalizable insights to inform programming and practice around the world, and not only on the countries where the research has been conducted. And we are very lucky to have a wonderful group of academics here on the screen as well, who advise us in this work and guide us throughout all decisions. So as I mentioned, we've been doing this for 3 years now, and we're very happy to have funded over 90 studies in almost 40 countries, as you can see here on the map. And that research is being conducted by more than 240 researchers. And we hope to be sharing through these webinars with you the emerging insights of the research, as well as how we can apply those findings to policy through these webinars. So please keep an eye for our next events. So delving into what we are going to discuss today, our question of the webinar is a very important research and also policy relevant question. So what is the role of state institutions, including the police, in preventing and responding to violence against women? Beforehand, we just want to acknowledge that this is a very challenging topic, especially given recent events around the world involving police brutality and the state's response to violence against women. So we hope that this discussion today can help us touch upon the potential and also limitations and challenges of state institutions in combating violence against women. And we are very happy to have 4 amazing panelists here discussing with us today this very important question. Panelists who are deeply immersed in this question. So we have Sabrina Karim, who is the Hardy's Family Assistant Professor in the Department of Government at Cornell, and she will start the presentation giving us an introduction of the literature on police response to violence against women, and also frame what we know about this topic. Following her, we have Nathan Fiala, who is an associate professor at the University of Connecticut, and he will present us some emerging insights from his CVI-funded project on the street police patrols and crime against women in public spaces in India. And Sandeep Sukonta is an associate professor of economics at the University of Virginia, and he will share also results from his project evaluating reforms to increase women's access to security. And then to close the discussion, we'll have Megan O'Donnell, who is an assistant director of the Center for Global Development's Gender Program and a senior policy analyst. And she'll speak to us about how these results can be interpreted and applied in practice. So just some housekeeping before we start. We'll have each presenter do their presentation, and then we'll have the discussions and questions in the end. If you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to put them in the Q&A function, which you might be able to see below on your screen. And we will ask those questions to the panelists at the end. And also, if you feel comfortable, please include your name and your affiliation so the speaker know who they are answering to. Also, just a reminder that we are recording this presentation. So we'll share the recording at the end, and it will be included in our event page in case you are interested in sharing with partners or colleagues that were not able to join today. So I'm sharing my screen. I'll be changing slides. And now I'll turn it over to Sabrina. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much for having us today to discuss this very important topic and to discuss and to provide some background to these two really important interventions from which I think we can learn a lot. So I will just give a background on the literature, but really kind of delving into what we know about different treatments and outcomes related to police interventions, specifically directed at reducing violence against women. So go to the next slide. So I just want to start by thinking about what kind of interventions have been done in the work already. And this is probably not an exhaustive list, so I apologize if I'm missing a number of countries or other people who have done work, but this is just from my examination of the literature, what interventions have we seen? And one of the most common ones is this idea that female police officers really matter for solving this problem of violence against women. And we've seen interventions in Liberia and obviously, in today's presentation in India, but there's been other studies in India as well. And these findings tend to be null. And I have some thoughts about that, about why that might be the case. And that basically just means that, having female police officers and just female police officers isn't necessarily in of itself creating more reporting or reducing violence against women, and that's the ultimate outcome that we care about. So secondly, there is kind of a newer innovation of this kind of idea about the importance of female police officers, but rather instead of female police officers, we're creating women-only spaces for women to report. And this is we see this in today's studies, but India is not the only place or only country where we see the availability of women-only police stations. Other countries have created these kinds of spaces, but I haven't seen an evaluation of them in the same way. And there's kind of mixed results about these, whether or not such spaces can actually get to our end outcome of reducing violence against women. Another common intervention is just exposure to policing. So does more policing create a deterrent for violence against women? And here, not all of these studies, the Liberia, India, and the EGAT Medicata look at violence against women necessarily as an outcome in of itself, but an outcome amongst many different crime outcomes. And here there's mixed evidence. So when we do have policing, it can deter some crimes, but not all crimes. And sometimes it's deterring violence against women and sometimes it's not. And I should mention the EGAT Medicata is a good one to look at. So this is a study. These are 5 studies done in Brazil, Colombia, Pakistan, Philippines, and Uganda that look at this kind of community policing model, which could be a deterrent, or it could be the fourth intervention here, which is just community policing and outreach in general, is meant to build trust with the community. So therefore, then you get more reporting, or it can serve as a deterrent. And here there's studies again in Brazil, Colombia, Pakistan, Philippines, Uganda, Papua New Guinea, and Liberia. And then finally, again, the findings are mixed here on whether or not police outreach can actually increase trust. That's usually the outcome variable with that kind of intervention. So the final intervention is kind of, I think, one that isn't intentional, but rather that's done as a part of other interventions. And we haven't really, and mainly because we haven't figured out the best way to randomize an intervention around training and professionalization that's not just like a training program that is like 10 days or 3 days. That's not a strong enough treatment, right? But we do seem to find from these studies that training and professionalization in particular do seem to make an impact for a number of the outcomes that we're interested in. Maybe not, again, this end outcome on violence against women, but some of these studies here have found that they do increase trust, and that the policing behavior changes, and the police themselves have a different idea about how to do their job, which may make the entire process better. So what I think, what you can notice here is that there's not a clear theory or a clear mechanism through which, or one intervention in particular that we're looking at that can reduce violence against women, but there's going to be a combination of different kinds of interventions. And this is just a handful of what we can do. So we can go on to the next slide. These studies have looked at different kinds of outcomes. Again, really, if we're trying to get to this reduction of violence against women, there's a number of outcomes that we need to look at before getting to that stage. And so these are some of those. So, are women or people in general reporting the crime of violence against women? That's a very important outcome to look at. Another common outcome in these studies is satisfaction surveys. So how satisfied are people with the services that they're receiving from the police? With the assumption that satisfaction is going to, again, increase reporting, and then reporting, will lead to a deterrent for men and other people to not actually engage in that behavior. So it's really kind of downstream. Finally, or not finally, but there's also the attitudinal changes among citizens and attitudinal changes amongst police that are important, potentially important outcomes as well. So by attitudinal changes among citizens, I mean that there's a whole host of things that we could measure here, and everything from trust in the police to get to that stage of reporting, or just attitudinal changes in general about women or about violence. Right? Are we mitigating preferences or belief systems about the costs of violence, for example? With the police, it's also really important to look at the fact that the police can be treated as well. And so here we want to look at whether or not police officers take violence against women seriously, or take women's issues seriously when they're engaging in their daily practice of policing. And that's something, and different interventions can affect that. And then finally, this is the real outcome that we care about, which is observations or instances of violence and harassment or violence against women. And that's the ultimate outcome that we want to get to, but that's a really hard outcome to get to without really these other outcomes, thinking about these other outcomes as well. So what I want to do is kind of link possible mechanisms and treatments to different outcomes that will that will allow us to better understand kind of what can change what. Because I think, right now the studies we're looking at all these outcomes, and we're looking at, different treatments, but really theoretically, we can link certain interventions to different outcomes. So first of all, if we think of the treatment of exposure to female police officers, so again, we're going back to the idea that female police officers can somehow make a difference. The idea might be that the female police officer is treating women in the public. So when women see female police officers, they're going to respond positively to people that look like them, to other women, so to the female police officer. It might also be that maybe women see that they have common ground with the female police officer, and so therefore trust them. And so here the outcome would obviously be perceptions of police officers, which police officer is approached first in the police station, for example, and then reporting. Another way that exposure to female police officers could be a treatment is that the female police officer is actually the one that's being treated, right? So her interactions with victims or her interactions with people that have experienced violence are going to trigger either that the female police officers to care more about the women's issue or to feel more loyalty to women. And so here we should observe police perceptions of violence against women change, in particular female police officers' response changing. And we might see maybe the female police officer is going to take more cases and push for more convictions. Right? Finally, we might see that male police officers are treated by the female presence. And this might then mean that the male police officer is emulating what the female police officer is doing, because, with the assumption that maybe she can handle these kinds of cases better. And so we would maybe observe that male police officers' perceptions of female police officers are changing, or that they're changing the way that they engage in policing to be more in line with what female police officers are doing. Okay. So the next treatment that I had mentioned was the availability of women-only spaces. And again, there's a few ways that this might work. So first, these women-only spaces in police stations might signal something to women in the public. So if women in the public have knowledge about the fact that the police have created a special space for them, they might perceive the fact that the police are on their side, that they're working for them. So we should observe changes in satisfaction surveys and reporting in this case. Another way that this might work is with being present in space treats women in public. So women feel safe in the public space. And then finally, word of mouth, knowledge of the space treats public. So people in the public might know about the women-only spaces, and in particular men, and they may be deterred because they see that there's an active push by the police to do something about the problem. Okay, and I'll just go through these really quickly. So exposure to policing as a deterrent, this is fairly obvious. So if you put police out there, does it deter crime? And if you're putting police out there, they're gonna probably arrest more people. And it's possible that people's perceptions might change. They might either see the police as more effective, or they might feel more insecure, depending on what their priors about policing in general. And then community policing outreach is very similar, the mechanisms. So you're building trust with the police-citizen relationship, you're improving that, you're spreading information about violence against women, people have more access to the police, and then it could be a deterrent. Okay. And this is the treatment that I think we need to think a little bit more about. So what is it about training and professionalization that lead the police to do a better job? Is it that they have better knowledge about the problem, violence against women? Is it that they have more sensitivity to women's needs because of the training? Or is it that they're better able to cooperate and coordinate amongst themselves and therefore engage in better policing? So this is where I think we could move forward a little bit, so we can keep going. I just want to touch on some limitations, which I think are very important. So most of these interventions are focusing on the victim, right? So we're trying to get the victim to report or the victim to respond in some way. And the treatments are not necessarily about mitigating the problem by the abuser or the perpetrator. Now, maybe the deterrence treatment might do that, but it's not really geared, it's not directed at the abusers or the perpetrators, right? Secondly, and very importantly, in probably every country, there is at least some group of people that don't find the police legitimate, or that find the police to be the ones that are the abusers and the perpetrators. They are, state sanctioned in terms of being able to use force, and so if they are the ones committing violence, then it's really hard to engage them in the process of resolving violence against women if they themselves are seen as the perpetrator. Finally, if we're relying on women police officers, it's really problematic sometimes, and also I think the expectations are misguided that they can be the ones to solve the problem, because female police officers are themselves facing a number of gendered issues when they're in the police force themselves, right? So they face a number of pressures that would not necessarily make them behave any differently than men. And if anything, they kind of have to prove their worth and their belonging in the police. So the expectation that they would serve women's needs more so is perhaps misguided. Finally, and this is what I alluded to, is that getting to that ultimate outcome of violence against women, reducing it, is a multi-stage process, right? So we don't know which one of these stages is most important, whether it's for changing perceptions, increasing reporting, the case management. By case management, I mean, like, it's not just about reporting, but what happens after that reporting stage. What happens to the case, how many cases actually, make it to the courtroom, et cetera, and convictions, and then deterrence. So there's lots of different angles towards kind of mitigating this problem, and we don't necessarily know which one is the most important. Okay. So just, next steps, I think if we're in an ideal world, things that we could randomizing different procedural justice elements of the case management process and conviction process. If there were ever a world where we could randomize different punishments to see if there's different responses to deterrence, what training and professionalization works, this is what I alluded to, and then police accountability and transparency is really important, especially if police are perceived to be perpetrators themselves. And then finally, maybe the focus should not be on the state, right? Maybe if we really care about violence against women, the state response is not the answer. And so maybe we want to focus on randomizing programs that might focus on the perpetrators themselves, whether that's through not NGOs or civil society programs. There have to be other ways to focus on reducing violence against women without state response or without the police. And then obviously we want to do this in more countries. So thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina, so much. So now, I'll hand it over to Nathan.
Great, thanks a lot. Thank you very much for having me and for everybody that's attending. So I'm going to be presenting some work I'm doing with many co-authors in Hyderabad, India, working on measuring and trying to reduce street harassment of women. Next, please. Okay. So I probably don't need to motivate street harassment of women to most people in this group. It is a serious problem. And it's, anecdotally, maybe it's not quite as bad in Hyderabad as it is in Delhi and some other big cities in India, but it's still a problem there. And there is a lot of concern about it. We also had a high profile assault in 2019 that led to 4 deaths related to harassment. And so I won't talk much about that other than say you can go ahead and Google that. That's a really unfortunate event. So the evidence of police patrolling on street harassment, it's a crime that's, it's common. It's often very highly tolerated. It's really hard to detect. Police do have a hard time detecting it, and we do see that in this study. And there's a large variation in the type of harassment that can happen. Anything from just simple staring up to full-on assault. But these are all things that we do consider to be harassment and do make women uncomfortable in India. Next, please. So our research question is going to be around how can gender-based violence in the public sphere be prevented or reduced? We're going to do that through a randomized study of a hotspot street police patrolling intervention that's going to target gender-based violence and harassment in public spaces. Our main result, I'll give a little hint as to it a little bit later, but we're working on it now. We're still working through some of the analysis. Yeah, so we're also looking at what's driving some of these changes. We're going to vary how we're going to be approaching this task. And then we're also going to be doing something a little bit novel with thinking about how to measure changes in incidents. So one option, a very common option, would be to ask women whether or not they're being harassed in these areas that we're going to be working in. But we do have concerns that this can be a bit biased, a bit underpowered. And so we're going to actually introduce a novel way to measure this in this study. Next. So the program that we're going to be working with is called She Teams. This is something that's done through the Hyderabad City Police. It's the Safety, Health, and Environment Program. it's teams of 4 officers that patrol a hotspot. Now, let me define a hotspot real quick. A hotspot is any place where a lot of people are gathering and where the police have predetermined is very likely to be a place where there can be some harassment. So the most common ones would be bus stops, bus stations, some markets. They vary in size. They can be small, they can be big, they can be very, very crowded, they can be a little bit less so. But they're places that the police have pre-identified before we came in that they know to be places that harassment is very likely. The officers are supposed to spend 15 to 20 minutes at a hotspot and between the hours of 2 to 7 p.m. And then we vary 2 types of teams. So we have uniformed officers and we have undercover officers. Now, the undercover officers are the normal SHE team model. This is where the police are normal police officers dressed in regular street clothes and are walking around these hotspots looking to identify harassment and violence against women. We worked with the police to think about a somewhat slight change to the program to include uniformed officers. And so what we're going to be able to do in this study is, at least theoretically, tell the difference between having more police, having this specialized undercover police team. And of course, we're going to have a control group here where it's just normal policing that's done as the police normally do. Next, please. So again, these are, again, as I said, the hotspots. So this is a picture of the city of Hyderabad with all the different hotspots that we have here. We randomly divided 350 hotspots into either an undercover, a uniformed, or a control area. And we have also another 700 hotspots that we're measuring for spillovers. So we're interested, and this is something that's been identified in literature on street policing, that you may reduce crime in one area, but it maybe just moves right next door. So some research in Colombia found that street policing, I believe in Bogota, reduced crime on the street that the police were walking in, but it just moved it over to the next street over. And so we're very interested in measuring whether or not that's also a possibility here. Next, please. So we're going to observe harassment in these public spaces. What we're going to do to try and get the best quality measurement that we can is we're going to be using our enumerators. We're going to be using observation of our enumerators while they're at hotspots to determine what kind of harassment they're observing in these areas, with the goal that hopefully with this policing intervention, it reduces these types of harassments and violence. So the enumerators, they observe harassment while at a hotspot and traveling between hotspots. They spend, or they go to 6 locations per day and spend about 15 to 20 minutes at each location. And what this allows us to do is to have a lot of high frequency data. And so each location is going to be covered once a week for the span of about 6 months. So we have quite a bit of data on each of these hotspots. A lot of hotspots, a lot of data on them. And then we're assigning a route randomly by enumerator. We're worried about enumerator effects, so we're trying to avoid that issue. So we also did an officer survey by phone, but we're also doing a little bit more data collection. I'll talk about that in just a second. We were going to do lots and lots of other things as well, but then COVID-19 happened. We were going to be doing a victimization survey that is actually talking to women in these hotspots, but because of COVID, the hotspots were locked down, or it's not safe for us to go there. We're going to do measurements on women's mobility, and then we were also interested in some labor market outcomes, assuming that we're able to make, or that the police are able to make these hotspots safer. Are women more likely to travel through the safer ones? But we can't measure any of that because, again, COVID. Next, please. I said I would give a slight hint. We've looked at the data. We've done some initial tests on it. Our initial results are not looking very positive. It looks very likely that there is no, or at least we're not identifying an effect from any of these interventions on the observation of our main outcome, our observation of harassment at these places. Why in general might we be finding no effects? Well, we're doing a little bit more data collection to try and tease this out, but let's just think about what could be going on here. Does marginally increasing policing do nothing? It's entirely possible. Now, I appreciate Sabrina's discussion about how, what we might expect or hope from policing, but if the police are not, doing the right work, if they're causing part of the problem, there's lots of reasons why we might think that increasing policing may do nothing in this area. We also, we're doing a little bit of work to try and figure out officer motivation. I think this is really important to understand. Is the SHE team something that officers want to actually be a part of? Is it something that they want to be working in? So we're trying to understand that as well. We're also interested in understanding whether or not the enumerators are measuring the same things as the officers are. Do our enumerators observe harassment in the same way that a police officer does? And do they observe it in the same way that a random woman in one of these areas would as well? So we're actually having a novel data collection that we're going to be using to try and measure whether or not police observe something as a harassment or a crime, and whether or not our enumerators do as well. Last thing I'll say on this slide is I personally have come around to feel that our clustered RCT may be the wrong design, at least when it comes to undercover policing. So when an individual is aware of, say, undercover policing meant to reduce harassment in Hyderabad, by definition, undercover policing is supposed to be undercover and unknown. You don't know where they are, right? So to define a hotspot and to expect that an undercover police officer is going to be able to make a change in that hotspot, while another hotspot over here that is a control is not going to be changed, I think could be a wrong assumption here. So it's entirely possible that the SHE team program is having huge effects on harassment across Hyderabad itself, but when it comes to individual hotspots, a perpetrator may not be able to update properly to know that's a hotspot that's being patrolled, that one is not, and that just might get complicated. Now, when it comes to actually uniform policing, that's something we shouldn't be quite so worried about, but yeah, something that is on our minds a little bit here. Next, please. Oh, and that was the end of my slides. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Nathan. Okay, I'll hand it over to Sandeep now.
Great. Thank you so much, Isabella. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to be presenting some work that's been a long time in the making. This is a project that we've been working on for almost 4 years now. It's co-authored with Gabby Crooks-Fisner, who's also here at UVA, and Akshay Mangla at Oxford. And before I begin, I really want to thank our partners, the Madhya Pradesh Police Department, who have been working so hard. This is an enormous intervention, as you'll see, spread across the state, 12 districts, 180 police stations, over 20 million people who are under the jurisdiction of these police stations. And then, of course, our funders, CVI and the World Bank's SBRI, as well as the massive team at JPAL South Asia, without whom this evaluation would not have been possible. Next slide, please. So I think we're well motivated here. This is a part of the world where sexual violence is prevalent. It's increasing. There's this report that got a lot of press recently about India being the world's most dangerous country for women. Whether you believe it or not, I don't think you can argue with the fact that this is an issue and something that is concerning to everyone, including the police. One of the issues that we've seen, again, Sabrina set all of this up really, really nicely for us. And you'll see how everything that she said is going to map really well with what we study, and then some very interesting results on what we find. But one of the first things that people generally agree is that reporting and registration of these crimes against women is a necessary first step. Whether that actually leads to reduced crime because of deterrent, etc., we don't quite know, but at the least we hope that this sort of reporting and registration will at least reduce the sort of culture of impunity, that you can do things and completely get away with it, nobody will even know about it. Okay, and that's a huge issue in India, of course, because there's extreme underreporting. So there's a study in our context that suggested that only 4% of women who were experiencing violence actually even tried to report it. So next slide, please. So what has the government done? The government wants to do things, obviously is not pleased with this. So they are trying to improve the police's response to women and try to make the police more approachable so that women come to them and see them as helpers rather than actually abusers or perpetrators. So one very well-known intervention is these women-only police stations. That creates both the space and the interaction with female personnel. And that's been studied a little bit. There's these vehicles that is similar to the SHE teams that we just heard about with patrolling hotspots. There's dedicated phone lines. Until now, at least, there's been sort of limited testing. There is some testing, but as Sabina pointed out, the results are either null or mixed in all these cases, and we don't really know whether women will actually use these sort of gender-targeted services. Are women going to approach female officers because they feel more comfortable or not? And then the other questions, again, which Sabrina set up, which were, well, will police actually respond to these treatments? Will their attitudes change? Will their behavior change? Now, I want to mention that this is all in a context with really, really limited state capacity and resources. So in our context, we calculated that the police force is 1.2 police officers per 1,000 civilians, which is really quite on the low side of this around the world. For context, the US is nearly twice that. Next slide. So what did we do? So we did this large-scale RCT working with the police department in an intervention that tried to increase the accessibility and responsiveness of the police to women to make them more approachable. I think I mentioned this quickly, but we'll see this in a little while. This is think of this as at scale as is. This is not a sort of small pilot by any means. Though, of course, for the police, 12 districts out of 51 is still just a study. So what was the treatment? This was a treatment that had indeed been sort of attempted before. So this is not something that we were imposing externally. This idea has been floating around. Many different states in India have this, and the idea here that the key, and this is probably going to be key to the results, we can discuss this later. The idea is to sort of mainstream the idea of a woman thana by, instead of having a separate place where women go to a different police station and are only get help there, to mainstream it into a regular police station. So this is sort of dedicated spaces at the police station staffed by trained officers who are trained to help women. Okay, and so this is sort of this last mile intervention is probably, given the scope, the largest gender targeted initiative by the police in India. So what we do, again, this is literally, you could go through Sabrina's slides, but the impacts, the outcomes we examine are, whether women approach the police, whether they report and register, and whether these crimes are registered, perceptions of victims as a sort of satisfaction survey, as well as police officer attitudes. We also collected data on whether women are approaching police or not. We're not going to see that data today, and we're not going to see the citizen survey data today because we're still in the process of analyzing it. We also got hit by COVID, so we got far fewer observations and at a much later time than was ideal. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this was at scale. So this took place in 12 districts in the state of Madhya Pradesh. They were chosen to start with the 4 largest cities, the districts with the 4 largest cities, and then basically spread them so that every sort of distinct ethno-geographic region is represented. So it was a purpose of selection, but as you'll see, other than obviously the 4 biggest city districts, everything else looks very similar because it was sort of picked to look like the other parts of Madhya Pradesh. So in that sense, it's representative, other than the fact that it's a little bit urban skewed. Next slide. So what were these women's help desks? So what were these spaces? So we worked with the police to create an intervention that was comprised of a bundle of things, a bundle of components that could be scalable. Okay, so they were easy to understand. Again, map well into what we saw before. One is creating physical spaces that is a sort of desk or an area, could be a room, at the police station itself. The second is standard operating procedures and training provided to police. And again, the idea was to make this portable, to make this simple to understand, because a lot of the times what we saw in our piloting was that often police aren't quite aware of, for example, the Indian IPC codes, the Indian penal codes, under which specific types of crimes should be registered or not. Okay, they're not aware of sort of interagency coordination issues. We'll see that this becomes very important later on, and so that is what the training component involved. Of course, there has to be a component of community outreach, without which people don't know that this is something that the police was doing. And then the final piece was allocating a female officer to run the desk to see if people are more likely to actually come and report when they see a female officer. Next slide, please. So you'll see what we call the full component or female-run help desk is a police station that has all four of these to compare the impact of whether having a female officer assigned to run the help desk makes a difference or not. We also have a treatment arm that only has 3 of these components and not all 4. And then, of course, there's a control group. So this is what things look like. So we purposely picked these to show you sort of really nice and not so nice. So it ranged from a fancy room that was constructed overnight for the official launch. It was fantastic. You'll see it's very clean, brand spanking new, to the space on the right, where you can see that there is an attempt being made, but obviously it's not quite in use. But there was a whole span of this. The trainings took place at various levels, from the headquarters to zonal to district to the police station level itself. And we'll come back to the training and what level mattered towards the end. But this was, again, you can see there's animated discussion. This was done. In fact, the intervention was handled by the training wing. It was the sort of research and training wing of the police. And so this, they kind of, this is sort of their bread and butter, so to speak. Next slide, please. And then community outreach, this was sort of involved trying to get people. The top picture are these sort of ASHA and USHA health workers, community health workers that are being told about this so that they can spread it out. At the bottom, you see sort of police going out to a market conducting an event. And all of these, the little picture you saw on a couple of slides before, as well as all these materials were created specifically for the intervention. Next slide, please. So the design is pretty simple. You get a sense of already. So these are 180 police stations. The frame was police stations. They're not sort of the special Mahila stations, the female stations only. They were also, the police also did not want these extremely remote stations. They thought the footfall just wasn't high enough, so they excluded those. But otherwise, so that's how you can think of them. These are 180 police stations in these 12 districts that are sort of urban skewed, but otherwise regular old police stations. Okay, and so then we stratified it by geography, whether it was urban or not urban, really, as well as sort of how big it was. And then within these strata, we randomly allocated into 3 groups, 2 treatment groups and 1 control group. And the 2 treatment groups, one, of course, has the full bundle, and one does not get assigned female officers to run the help desk. That doesn't mean that female officers can not run the help desk in that case. It's just that they don't get this extra officer. It's not quite extra. That again, we can discuss some of the details. but they won't get a person that's allocated, a woman who's allocated to run this desk. So then we collected comprehensive data sources. Again, working with the government, working with the police has its advantages because they were able to share with us administrative data. So we have registration records. I've highlighted those here. But linking back to something that Sabrina said, we also do have data on action taken. We're still trying to analyze that and figure out what it actually means, but we do have that data as well. And one really nice thing that we did was we just captured CCTV data from the front of the police stations. And then we're just going to use machine learning to figure out whether more women are coming in or out. So that's the technical bit that we're still working on. But that will tell us is literally whether more women are coming to the police station or not, which we hope is really nice. Then we did a quick user satisfaction survey at the police station itself, quickly right after they had come, 5 minutes, are you happy or not? We did a longer police survey with up to 2,000 police officers that were at these 180 stations. We did a citizen survey, which we're not going to get into today for basically reasons related to COVID, and we're still struggling with how to interpret and analyze it. We also had a qualitative component, which is really interesting for adding sort of flavor and meat to the bones, and also just helping us really understand the mechanism. So we had it done in the same sort of format, with people visiting these different police stations across the control arms, and whether it was rural or urban or not. Next slide, please. So as I said, this was a long-term process because it took a long time to sort of pilot and start. So the initial preparation and trainings took place as long ago as October and November 2018, but then there were state elections, so everything had to pause. And then we had to convince a new government that came in that this was still worth continuing, which they did, thankfully. And after that, things went on sort of with sort of renewed vigor for the preparation for the trainings. And we can consider that most places were ready to go around by April 2019. Of course, then we were hit by COVID, so we're going to show you results up to and including March 2020, at which point the big lockdown happened in India. We did our own monitoring to see how the intervention was proceeding at 2 points, one in July and one in December. So then we have data, administrative data for every month, and then for all the other sources, we have data sort of a baseline observation and an endline observation. Next slide, please. So this is kind of like our first stage. To what extent did the intervention actually take place? And you'll see that for most of these components, there are by the time we did the second round of monitoring in December, things are actually happening. Overall, good job on sort of the tangible components. Was there a room? Was there an officer assigned? Tick, tick. Now, whether trainings were held at the police station level, whether a lot of outreach events were conducted, obviously that's a little bit harder. And so you would see that was not so great, especially the trainings in the outreach events in July were basically non-existent. All right, so now the results. So I should mention that all of these results are pre-registered. The outcomes are pre-registered on the AEA's registry trials. So all the analysis that I'm going to present was sort of was done exactly the way that we said we were going to be doing it. And you'll see very, very straightforward, huge jump in these DIRs, which are domestic incident reports. Okay, so what that is you can think of this as something that has both legal status as well as sort of forces interagency coordination with the Women and Child Welfare Department. And you'll see that basically beforehand, nobody really knew how to do this. Nobody knew what was doing it, right? In the control groups, especially, the reports are basically zero. After the intervention launches, they start increasing, and then boom, they just, when it's sort of fully operational, there's a huge uptake in that. The first information reports, that's sort of the standard, basically the registration by the police. That means this is a case that the police has to pay attention to legally. Those you'll see there's a slight uptick. The results are not always significant based on the specification. These are the first information reports filed by women. But we'll see some interesting results on that in just a second. But so one aspect of reporting very, very clearly goes up. Next slide, please. The other thing we want to know as well, did it displace other types of reporting? There's these non-cognizable reports, which are sort of like what the police want to do when they don't really want to file your case because they're non-cognizable. So the courts don't really pay attention to them. And so there you see that that's not changing very much. Nothing's happening there. And the bottom, the scale is a little bit messed up, but you'll see again, the overall FIRs in cases of crimes against women are slightly higher, but again, not always significant. Next slide, please. So this is a big result here, which is again maybe a little bit hard to see, but you'll notice that this is now there's no control group. This is comparing the two treatment groups. The regular FIRs, which is the bread and butter reporting, has gone up in both, if you look at both FIRs filed by women or just FIRs filed in women's cases of crimes against women. Before the intervention, the groups looked very similar. Afterwards, the police stations that had female assigned officers are much higher. And so, and this result is statistically distinguishable between the regular help desk as well as the control desk. So that this is sort of a very nice, robust result that suggests that frontline police officers are making a difference. Next slide, please. And I'm getting a little over, but this is almost done. So if you look at the user satisfaction survey, overall sort of modest, marginally significant. A lot of these results are significant at the 10% level, though maybe not at the 5% as you see here. Everybody's satisfied with the facilities because again, that was tangible, it's done. But if you ask them, are you satisfied overall? Well, maybe if you stare hard enough, you'll see this result. Either way, it's modest. The really interesting part is that there is a significant interaction with training. Again, this was pre-specified, so we're not just fishing for results, but the places that had more training at the local level, see higher satisfaction. Okay, and that again is a nice significant result. Next slide, please. On the other hand, if you look at what happened to police attitudes, we see very little change in police attitudes. We do see a clear change in their perception of activities that are given importance at the police station level. So it's clear that women, cases against women are now a priority for the police station. There's also an interesting result on sort of awareness. The police are actually less likely to think that they're doing a good job on cases against women, which is also quite interesting. But overall, that's basically what we see here. There's one result that's not on here, but that's interesting, is that female officers seem to be more responsive to training as well, right? I think this is my last slide. So that's basically it. So we see this change in behavior. Given what you have seen from Sabrina, this maybe initially you'd have thought, well, you did this intervention to increase reporting and reporting went up. What's the big deal? But again, if you paid attention to Sabrina's talk and the way we set it up, it's most places this doesn't work. We don't see these sort of big changes. Especially this idea that women that there's more reporting in places run by women. Now, whether that's because more women are coming into the station or whether it's because of the people that are coming, more cases are registered, we won't know until we fully analyze the CCTV data. Again, there's this other takeaway, which is that the police are really great at this sort of hardware of implementation, as we call it, not so good at the software. And then I want to end up by noting that just 2 days ago was the launch of this intervention, same branding as we transferred all the SOPs, training materials, everything, which the people managing the project from the police side were just fantastic in this. And now it's even more mainstreamed. It's spread to over 700 police stations all across the state, which is practically really every police station that's in the state that serves a lot of people.
Thank you, Sandeep. That also closing with a very good, scale up news. That's great. Awesome. Now I will hand it over to our last discussant, Megan.
Thanks so much, Isabella, and thank you to the previous speakers for their really rich presentations. Isabella and the JPEL team have asked me to now sort of reflect on the findings that you've just heard, positioning them within sort of a broader policy context. And to do that, I'm really going to emphasize, of course, the COVID crisis that has been top of mind for many of us in general, but especially when we think about gender-based violence. Nathan and Sandeep have underscored in their presentations the disruptions that the pandemic and the associated mobility restrictions had for research and evaluation and data collection. But just to take a step back, I think also critical to think about the impacts on the incidence of different types of gender-based violence as well. So with that in mind, 4 main points to share with you all. The first will be focused on sort of the incidence of violence and what we've seen over the past year due to lockdowns, but also due to broader sort of indirect impacts on things like financial insecurity and lost income for households and how that relates to increased violence. The second point is to bring in the policy angle. What are governments and donors doing in response? And how does that relate to the evaluations that we've just heard about? To what extent is there alignment? Or unfortunately, as you'll hear, sort of a gap between research and practice. Number 3 is what is being evaluated, sort of within the COVID context. What do we know about evidence-based interventions to be mitigating violence and supporting survivors? And then finally, and this is where I'll look forward to discussion with my fellow speakers, what should be prioritized for evaluation going forward? So on the first point, over the past year, primarily with a co-author, Amber Peterman, who's a non-resident fellow at CGD with me, and also an associate professor at UNC Chapel Hill, we've collected now over 100 papers that relate to gender-based violence and also violence against children within the COVID context. And not surprisingly, sort of consistent with early intuitions, but now backed up by much more rigorous data, we can point with increasing confidence to the fact that especially violence against women in the household has increased as a result of the COVID crisis. So about 75% of the papers that we examine, and this is across context, this is pretty much representative now of every continent, point to at least one increase in some measure of gender-based violence. And a subset of papers also look at risk factors. The majority of these, in addition to risk factors around mental health or around substance abuse, for example, really highlight the financial insecurity that the COVID crisis has caused, whether that's in terms of rising food insecurity, fear of starvation, lost employment, and therefore lost income as drivers of increased violence within households, thereby increasing tensions and increasing conflict, including with physical violence in mind. So with all of this as sort of the backdrop, what is being done? There we've turned to a resource that's been compiled by the United Nations Development Program in coordination with UN Women, which is a tracker documenting over 3,000 now policy response measures from national governments and territories, many of which focus on the response to the increase in violence against women. We see that of those 3,000 measures, over 800 of them are focused on violence. But in preparation for today's conversation, we did a little bit of a dive into any of the responses that are focused on policing. police training, female police officers, some of the interventions that you've heard discussed today. And interestingly, we find just 32 of the measures as they relate to violence have anything to do with police. I think that Sabrina gave us a really useful sort of framework at the outset of her talk, these 5 areas that she touched on. And I can map the data that we see from this UNDP UN Women Tracker into those areas that she mentioned. And this is where I think we'll start to see some of the gaps, perhaps, between research and policy and practice at present. In spite of sort of the importance that Sandeep's presentation underscored about the role of female police officers, and especially well-trained ones, in maybe increasing reporting and supporting survivors, just one of the 32 policy response measures have anything to do with female police officers. So that's in Jordan, where interestingly, the policy response seems to combine the use of female police officer units with community policing, where they're doing home visits, they're emphasizing psychosocial support and mediation rather than sort of a direct arrest approach. On the women-only spaces front, we really see nothing as it relates to police. There is one intervention coming out of Bolivia that focuses on adolescent girls and sort of empowerment spaces for them. So very much aligned with a paper some of you may be familiar with from the Ebola crisis that's been cited often by Oriana Bandiera and co-authors that showed that there was a positive impact of these safe spaces for adolescent girls in making sure they return to school post-Ebola. We're seeing a number of positive empowerment effects out of this intervention in Bolivia that was focused on safe spaces, including less risk of violence. So that's positive. Police as a deterrent, as Sabrina also mentioned as a category, and as Nathan emphasized in his presentation, we really just see one policy response measure aligned with that piece as well. That's out of Lithuania, where police have kept a log of survivors of GBV in the past and have sort of kept tabs on those households and been visiting those households before anything has been reported within the COVID context. So that's interesting. I mentioned sort of the combination of community policing with female police officers within Jordan, but that's about it there. And then finally, as Sabrina mentioned, this training piece is where we see the bulk of policy response measures falling. So out of Brunei, Greece, Honduras, the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Ukraine, etc., where there has been policy response in acknowledging that GBV has increased in the COVID context, it's come down to training. And through webinars, through relationships with ministries of women within country or with UN Women, the agency, bolstering the training and sort of support that police are being given. But then to turn to the evaluation piece that I mentioned, none of these trainings that we've seen so far have been evaluated. So out of the 100 papers that I mentioned we reviewed, we've seen just 5 of them actually be evaluations of interventions. This is a helpline in Italy, stimulus payments and firearm policies in the United States, an alcohol ban in Mexico, and that empowerment program that I mentioned in Bolivia. No evaluations to date, to our knowledge, on training. So if that is where the bulk of the policy response measures are falling in response to COVID, food for thought and open discussion about how evaluations of those trainings could be prioritized going forward. And then the final point in terms of what else should be evaluated, I really just want to come back full circle to some points that Sabrina mentioned at the start. Number one is sort of thinking about what should be evaluated as a bundled approach. So rather than thinking that one of these pieces can really be a silver bullet in isolation, and I think Sandeep's presentation underscored this nicely, the interaction of female police units with quality training. How do we think about other sort of bundled approaches that may be more effective and prioritize evaluating them? And then finally, also to emphasize, I think a great point by Sabrina, is the need to zoom out past the state and especially past police units, sort of in isolation as being the end all be all for especially reducing violence, right? Even if we think about their very important role in supporting survivors, how do we think about things that are going to ease the risk factors that are most prevalent? And if those are primarily around financial insecurity that are increasing household tensions, perhaps it is things like cash transfers, in-kind food aid, other sort of income generation opportunities that are going to get directly at those drivers of violence. Not to mention, right, the gendered norms underlying the violence justification. So with that, I will turn back to Isabella and look forward to discussion.
Thank you so much, Megan. I'll just skip the slide. Everyone was asking why did I not do it? Just because we were using a more organic discussion this time. So thank you all for presenting and sharing your thoughts, sharing your research. This was really, really amazing and illuminating. We do have questions from the audience. Thank you, April and Amy, for helping me aggregate all of them. So I guess we can start. Maybe Nathan, we have a question for you from Jonathan Strokes. So he is asking that he believes that you mentioned that there is a hypothesis or perhaps expectation that should harassers see that there are consequences for actions, there might be a corresponding fall in harassment. Considering the larger judicial process and the difficulty in bringing charges against harassers, both in minor as well as major incidents, how far can interventions aimed at the initial stage of the judicial system go? Is there a space or research into interventions aimed at the courts as another part of this particular state institution?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. I should, on further reflection, I thought that maybe I should have made a bigger point about my co-authors who all know a lot more about policing in India than I do. So I've been learning a lot as we've been going on. I do quite a bit of work around women's empowerment and violence and conflict, but this is a little bit new of an area for me. So I don't have like a really great answer to what interventions at the early stage of the judicial process might be like. But I think this is a really important point to make that if police are catching people doing things, but after they're caught, there's really no cost, right? So they're not being prosecuted or, they get away with it. This is something that, is not going to be a deterrent. Right. So we're facing that in America. We had people that invaded our capital. I'm hoping a lot of them end up in prison to, entice people to not do that again. But, if people get away with it, then there's not much that we can really hope for trying to change broader behaviors. So, yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think, going to what are some of the things that could be done for future research, and I think that's an area that would be really, really interesting to explore some more, is thinking about how to get these prosecutions better, faster, and more of them.
Thank you. So now I'll ask a question a little broader to all speakers. I guess, Sandeep, if you want to start, Nathan can follow, but I would love to hear everyone. So we got some questions around the ethics of designing experiments with police. How did you take ethical concerns into account in designing your evaluations? I guess more specifically also for Sandeep, how is consent for being video considered in ethics applications and approval? So you mentioned this is the video system, how is that being done? But I also love to hear from the other one.
Oh, and Isabel, maybe if you stop sharing your screen, then we could show up a little bit broader.
Sorry, okay. Oops, I'll do that.
No, thank you for that, because this was, this is obviously something that we considered very, very hard. Like we looked at this very, very hard. We worked with the IRB here, but not just the IRB. We wanted to sort of go beyond that. So we are working with the police. We are also partnered with ActionAid, which is an NGO that was working on these specific issues. And so they ended up eventually working with the police on the community outreach component separately. So that was a separate component. But even before that, we worked with them to make sure that everything that we do sort of made sense. Again, this in terms of the intervention itself, it was something that the police had attempted previously, although maybe not developed it as quite as sort of in a polished way and provided with all these materials. We also worked with a lawyer who's works a lot with the police, a senior lawyer who's part of has worked with the Delhi High Court and works a lot with police on these issues, on designing the SOPs, for example. And then in terms specifically of the CCTV data, so I think when everyone thinks about video, it's sort of a, it's just this big deal. It's far less of an issue that I would think, because CCTV is always recording everywhere we go now. It's common, it's clear, it's obvious. So in terms of how this would pass ethical review, I mean, it's a public, the court of a police station, is a public place. There's of course nothing that can link you specifically and identify you. At some points maybe you might be able to see people's faces, but all of that is kept obviously encrypted. And we don't care about who you are. All we care about is whether you're you present as male or female. And we are also not making that determination. We are letting the computer do that in the sense that we just give it a lot of, well, of course, with any AI, you have to train the computer. So yes, we are telling it what we think is male versus female, and then let it make that determination. It's not perfect, and so that's basically how we're still trying to figure out the kinks and things like that. Yeah, that's I guess broader. I'm sort of very happy to sort of keep talking more about this as we go along.
Maybe just to add sort of an additional dimension on the ethics front. I mean, I think we have had a lot of conversations over the past year, and there's been guidance issued by UN Women, by the World Bank Global Gender Practice, and others, alerting researchers to the ethical risks of going directly to women as victims or survivors if you cannot guarantee their safety, right? Under sort of business as usual circumstances, you'd be in a room with a trained enumerator, ensuring that there's no one else in that room, in that house, guaranteeing her privacy, her anonymity, her confidentiality from a potential perpetrator. When that can't be guaranteed over a mobile phone, I think it's worth noting that in addition to all of the sort of careful considerations Sandeep just outlined, it may actually be safer for the woman herself to be harnessing data through some of these AI methods, to be working with police stations on these sort of more macro anonymized data sets, rather than going directly to the potential victim or survivor.
And I guess I'll just make a quick comment as well on the ethics here. So we studied a program that's been ongoing in Hyderabad for some time. Our role was basically to reallocate where it was being done for a period of time. So we have a very strong relationship with the police. My co-authors do. So I guess for me, the ethics of the actual design and whatnot are not so much problematic, but I don't want to downplay that there is a serious ethical concern when working with police. I think especially it's a frontline issue. And I think it makes it a complicated thing and not something that we're interested in shying away from just because it's complicated. I think the complicatedness makes it important.
Thank you so much. So one other question around the broader literature. We received some questions, of course, about the other side of preventing the violence from happening in the first place through economic empowerment interventions or changes in social norms. But then that kind of brings to question to what extent should the state intervene. So as we've been discussing, there might be some moments in which the police might not be the best one to be addressing these cases. So if the state is not counting on the police, what are other institutions or other mechanisms in which governments and policymakers can be intervening to try to prevent and also respond to these issues? And is there any evidence around these other potential strategies that can be used by the state? I don't know who would like to start, but feel free to jump in.
I will just say one quick thing here, because I don't think I have a lot to say around the state, but I think this norms point is really important. And this is a problem in India. It's a problem around the world. This type of behavior by men is normalized in many ways. What I like about the type of policing role here is that it's trying to target the perpetrators. And I think that's what's missing from a lot of interventions that look at female empowerment and other related things. So I'm doing some work now in Tanzania and a few other places, thinking about how to integrate husbands and male members of the household into these types of trainings and sensitizations. I'm not saying these things work. It's really hard to change norms. You can't do a sensitization training in an hour. So that's, I think, a hard thing to move and something that's been very much on my mind.
Yeah, I can just say a few words here, and then I'm sure Megan has a lot to say about this as well. So yeah, there's, if we're thinking of non-state solutions or interventions, there's a number of places where we can start. And I honestly, personally think that if we're thinking about changing norms, that begins actually not when somebody is an adult, but rather at school age. Right, so thinking even as early as primary school. And there's a fantastic organization, Promundo, if any of you have heard about that does this work. I think they're one of the first organizations to really focus on the men and focus on masculinity in terms of changing norms and changing men's behavior. And they've done, some of their work has been evaluated through RCTs and some of it hasn't, but I think, looking at some of their models is really helpful in terms of like what kind of interventions we could do, for men as like Nathan said, a lot of these interventions are targeted at women, but I really do think that at least when it comes to changing norms and behavior, we should shift the focus a little bit. And that goes with the policing bit as well. I think there was a question in the chat about this idea about police officers are self-selecting themselves to become police officers. That means that they're a particular type of people and a particular type of man, if we're being honest, who already has kind of a tolerance for violence, if you will. So we should think also a little bit about who the police officers are that are being recruited, because they are different from the population, because they're self-selecting into this profession. And so that means that there's almost like an additional level or an extra level of cultural norms that we have to tackle when thinking about this problem when it comes to policing. So that I would recommend more interventions related to policing to change their behavior as well, so they can be part of the problem.
And I mentioned quickly in my earlier remarks, the role of cash, and obviously a lot of that can come from the state, right? And we've seen 200 countries and territories being sort of systematically tracked by the World Bank Social Protection and Jobs Unit, Ugo Gentilini and co-authors, documenting that as sort of the policy lever of choice in not just mitigating food insecurity and shelter insecurity as a result of COVID, but also thinking about the impacts that could have in reducing conflict within households. Of course, no belief in that being a silver bullet either. So oftentimes within the gender space, we talk about cash plus approaches, exactly as Nathan and Sabrina mentioned, engaging directly with the norms that justify violence against women. Promundo is sort of a go-to, I think, resource that comes top of mind for me as well. The other evaluations of interest that were underway and will hopefully continue are out of a program called SWED, which is the Sahel Women's Empowerment Demographic Dividend Project, kind of a mouthful. but it's across 5+ countries, I believe, Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania, Niger. And they're taking this interesting approach that uses what they call husband schools as a means of engaging men, not just in making sure that violence is sort of questioned and challenged and ultimately reduced, but thinking about the value of women in households as economic agents, as contributors to household decision-making. So yeah, very much echo what Sabrina said about needing to challenge those norms sooner in life and more broadly, so that it's not just sort of addressing the problem once it's already occurred.
That is awesome. Thank you so much, Nathan, for bringing up the social norms point. I think it was in the chat, and I totally agree that with everything you guys said, or bringing first the perpetrators in to also try to tackle this issue. But still, I believe that, as you mentioned, social norms being difficult to change and difficult to tackle, I feel like the interventions you guys evaluated and your work of helping governments and scale up effective solutions to also equip police to better respond to women is a necessary step, while change in terms of how we see violence, how societies see violence are not addressed. Might not be the silver bullet, might not change the issue and help us end this pervasive form of violence that we don't want to see around anymore, but it will help at least equip the police and could make survivors a little bit more comfortable with coming in and reporting, and then hopefully handling the cases and punishing perpetrators. So, well, that's my take on all of this. I have a last question, and we know we are at time. So this one, I guess, Megan, if you would, Megan and Sabrina, I guess, that have been discussing the literature, if you could tell us a little bit more where you see the area of research going. And you guys mentioned a little bit of priority areas for evaluation in the future, but as this world of COVID is still being a reality in many developing countries, maybe some areas of the world, hopefully we can see an improvement soon, but with the differences in how vaccines are being deployed around the world, we can expect a lot of communities to still be suffering from this for in the near future. So how do you see policymakers and researchers, what should they be looking for in terms of evaluating effective solutions and moving forward, how the evaluations should be focusing on this topic?
Yeah, so I'll just say two quick things and then turn it over to Sabrina. I think the first point, and this is a drum that my co-author Amber I mentioned and I have been beating, is we feel fairly confident in the evidence base that substantiates the fact that violence, at least within the household, has increased. And yet studies continue to sort of proliferate. That is the bulk of what we continue to collect and synthesize. So making that transition as a research community from the central question of has violence increased to what do we do about it seems fairly basic, but I'm hoping we're going to start to see that shift sooner rather than later. And then in terms of priorities for what to evaluate, I know I touched on this a bit earlier, but Isabella, I think your team, in creating this dialogue has given us an excellent first step in being able to map what research is being done, what policy measures are being announced, and where there are some gaps between those two things. So Sabrina, Nathan, Sandeep, as the experts on which interventions work and don't, governments need that knowledge, right? And they're doing, in some cases, maybe the wrong things. And in some cases, maybe they're doing the right things, but it's tough for us to evaluate the quality of a training, right? If all of these different trainings are being rolled out, how do we start to pick them apart and in more sort of nuanced understand what a good training looks like versus maybe a less good one? So those are my two quick thoughts.
Great, thank you. So, I'll just say 2 points as well. So I think on the non-state, I think shifting to the non-state part is really important. And we just, talked about different ways and different places where interventions can be done. In particular, I think schools and focusing on masculinity and teaching men and girls and boys, like what are healthy relationships and things like that are really important. And I would really like to see more work on that. But if we're thinking about policing and state response, there's definitely, I think, there's so many gaps, I think, that we still have. And Sandeep and Nathan's work has really moved us forward in terms of thinking about how specific and combinations of interventions might work and might play in India. And so, one obvious step is just seeing and thinking about the scope conditions or the conditions under which different interventions might work in different contexts. And I think in the Q&A, there was an important point about how the institutional characteristics of police really matter. So policing can be political. It happens, there's policing in weak states and strong states. Authoritarian governments have different police systems. And so really carefully thinking about which interventions make sense in which context and would actually work. So I could see this surveillance problem being much more of an issue in more of an authoritarian state where, even though there's women-only spaces, that doesn't necessarily mean that women are going to feel comfortable going to report because they still know that they're going to be, there's surveillance around what they're doing, right? So the conditions under which and the scope conditions for these interventions, I think, are important, as well as kind of pinpointing the procedure. So there's lots of different interventions, but really spending a little bit more time about thinking about the sequencing and which ones really do have the most impact. And I think, Nathan and Sandeep's work really helped us get a sense of that. But I think there's still a lot more work that can be done on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I would like to see if Sandeep and Nathan want to add anything to that as well, having been working on this issue and thinking, well, these are the questions we haven't answered, and this is what we hope people will do.
Yeah, so one thing I would add, and there was a quick question in the chat about how we were able to collaborate with the government as well. So this came about because the police approached JPAL, right? This was not us going and saying, hey, let's try these few things that we think it's fun to try. So, and in fact, our sort of main collaborator, Vineet Kapoor, is in the audience. So it's Vineet who approached Abhijit and JPAL to say, hey, we're interested, we want to do something, but we don't quite know, as you said, Sabina, some people are not quite aware of sort of what might work, what can be done. And so that, I think, was really interesting. And I think that was, made everyone sort of invested in trying to figure out what is and learn from this intervention. So I think, that if the police sort of want to know what to do and are trying to learn that and partner, I think that it makes a big difference. I don't know, I'll just sort of answering two things at once.
Yeah, we have quite a bit of interest from the Hyderabad Police Department in the work that we're doing as well. So I think having this really high level engagement and excitement around this, I think is very interesting. I'll mention that I'm also doing another project with my colleagues from Hyderabad in Bihar, looking at training police officers to try and improve their handling of gender-based violence complaints that when women come to police stations, handling, talking to the women, but also actually filing this paperwork and getting the process actually to happen. It's a couple-day training with some follow-ups. Is that going to change behavior of police officers? We're not sure, but we are pretty sure right now that the quality of this training does matter quite a lot as to whether or not people are going to respond to it. And we're going to be doing this in a couple of hundred police stations across Bihar, but we're still able to control a little bit and try to think about that quality. Once you try to do it in hundreds, thousands of police stations with tens of thousands of officers, training quality becomes a huge concern. And so I think that's something that's definitely weighing on my mind quite a lot with that project, but just in general with any of these types of training things, it's, quality matters. We know that. How to keep the quality high is, I think, maybe a big question.
Can I just add really quickly on the training point? So I often think that that's the Megan mentioned, like there were you found 30 plus examples of training. So this is like the go-to intervention because I think it's really easy to roll out and measure and do an RCT. But I think it's really important, as Nathan was saying, to figure out the different. Like, what is it about training that works and what is it that doesn't? Because even though Sandeep has found evidence and I found evidence that the quality of the police officer matters, does the training get us to that stage of where the police officer is a quality or professionalized police officer? And what elements of the training are the most important? So is it the information? Like, do they just need to learn the laws better or the procedures better? Or is it helping them connect to other police officers and other parts of the kind of chain of command or other institutions like the justice and health sectors, so they're coordinating better? So what is it about the training that actually works? I don't think we have the best answer for that part. And so Nathan, I think this research that you're doing is hopefully sounds really helpful for getting some of those answers.
That is so awesome. Thank you, guys. Unfortunately, we are at time. I know there are many questions that we were not able to reply or answer, but hopefully this discussion was informative, clarifying, helping you think around next policy measures that could be effective, as well as open questions for future research. So I want to thank you, our speakers, Sabrina, Nathan, Sandeep, Megan. You were amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, to share your thoughts, to prepare, and also be able to answer the questions and have this amazing discussion. I also want to thank IPA and JPAL teams who have helped me put this together, disseminate, and get our speakers prepared. So please stay tuned for information about our next webinar. As I mentioned, it will happen on April 23rd. And also stay tuned as a plug for the work that the JPAL team and as well as IPA's Peace and Recovery program team has been doing to synthesize evidence around gender-based violence, not only, but also other effective policy measures that are trying to tackle crime and violence and also improve recovery after conflict. So that will all come out soon through an updated version of our GCCI evidence review. So please stay tuned to see that, hopefully later in April coming out. So thank you all, and I'll end our event now.